So we're really delighted that Mya Rose has joined us tonight. Mya Rose Craig is a naturalist, ornithologist, birder, environmentalist, conservationist, activist, writer and broadcaster. She's been birding all her life and got her BTO bird ringing license at 16. She also became the youngest person to see half the world's birds when she was 17 in Brazil in 2019. Mya Rose is founder and president of non-profit organisation Black to Nature, which runs nature camps for visible minority ethnic children. In February 2020, she received an honorary doctorate from the University of Bristol, which is awarded in recognition for her advocacy for VME young people. So Mya Rose, I shall hand over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be speaking to people tonight, and obviously if you have any questions along the way, just stick them in the chat and I'll answer them at the end. Yeah, so I guess to introduce myself, my name is Mya Rose. I'm 18 and I do a lot of work to do with environmentalism and taking people out into nature, but my story begins long before that, when I was a baby, because I've always had a really strong relationship with nature. I've always loved spending time outdoors, and my parents were massively into nature and bird watching in particular, long before I was ever even born. So I was sort of born into a family that took me out all the time. And bird watching played a massive part in my childhood because of that, where you know, I guess it was everything. It was what we did every weekend. I was just spending all my time outdoors. And I was also very lucky because I was able to spend a lot of time traveling when I was a child. We went all over the world looking for new and rare bird species. And it was an incredible childhood. And I think there's one trip, it was the very first trip we went on when I was a child, that really sticks in my memory, mainly because it was the first one we'd ever done, or my parents had ever planned. It was quite a few disasters or near disasters ended up happening on that trip, and the one that probably traumatized my parents happened on our very first day in South Africa, where we were in Kruger National Park. And this whole trip we were in this big 4x4. We were driving all over the country looking for, or my dad was driving all over the country looking for birds. And this very first day in Kruger, it was this very classic African safari. It was very open. You were driving all over the place. You weren't supposed to leave your car because there were all these predators and things like that. The only reason we got out of the car was because there was a bird hide, and we had to go in the hide to look for the really rare species. And it was a very common theme in my childhood that we were sort of taking the slightly risky route because we just had to try and see the bird. But that day it was absolutely fine. We saw the bird, we had a really nice time until we came back to the car. And despite it being slightly dangerous, my parents really were taking their time that day. They were sort of having a chat as they loaded things into the boot. And I was very small at the time as well. I was only 4, but I was very small even for a 4-year-old. My head was about the height of our 4x4 tires, and I was just sort of wandering off by myself. And at this moment, while my parents were taking their time, this car raced past with its lights flashing and its horn honking, and nothing really occurred to my parents that something might be wrong. So they just made some comment about rude drivers and carried on doing what they were doing. But eventually they thought we should probably get back in the car. And it was just as they locked the doors that this lioness and her cubs emerged from the grass. And it was in that moment that they realized that this lion had been stalking me and was about to eat me. And it wasn't the only time that things like that happened when I was a kid, but it was, like I said, always worth it for the birds. but I'm also half Bangladeshi. My mum's family is Bangladeshi, and as I got older, I really started to notice that there just wasn't really anyone else that looked like me or my family going out into nature or spending time in nature. And I think it was something that took me a really long time to really register, I suppose. But by the time I was 11 or 12, I was very aware of it, whether it was going out into the reserves in the countryside and not seeing anyone who didn't look like me, or whether it was like chatting to my family, chatting to my cousins, and them just not understanding even slightly why I would want to be spending my time, my weekends outdoors with wildlife, with nature. And yeah, this all sort of culminated until I was 11 or 12, and I really started to think about why it was such an issue in the first place, because it felt sad, basically, as someone who'd spent so much time out in nature as a child, that other kids weren't getting that same opportunity, especially when it was something that was so important to me personally. And it all sort of culminated when I was 13. Um, so my friends were always very nice about me, like, liking birds, liking bird watching, stuff like that, but they never really got it. In fact, they, like, really didn't get it. And they always thought it was slightly strange that that was how I enjoyed spending my time. So when I was 13, I decided that I wanted to run a nature camp, like the ones that they did in America, to just hang out with some other kids that liked the same things as me for a weekend. And I spent ages planning it, and it seemed like it was going to go really well. Loads of people signed up. I was feeling really good about it until I sort of looked through the list and I realized that it was just like teenage boys basically, who were all older than me, and most of them were very middle class, or all of them were very middle class. And I think that was the final moment that made me think, like, there is clearly something going on here and I want to do something about it. And I decided for that camp that I was, whether they wanted to or not, I was going to go into Bristol where I live, and to get some kids, get some teenagers and bring them out on this camp and show them just how good nature can be, just how enjoyable it can be. And this was probably only a month before the camp was due to happen. So it was also all quite last minute, which I guess retrospectively was part of the fun, but it felt very stressful at the time. Um, so eventually we found 5 boys from like a very inner city Bristol who decided that they would come on this camp. And I was really excited about it until we picked them up and we brought them out into the countryside that Friday, and they made it very clear very quickly that they didn't particularly want to be there. They had other things to do that their mums had sent them, so that their parents could sort of get a weekend away from the kids, that sort of thing. And immediately it was just like, oh my gosh, what have I done? This was a terrible idea. It's all going to go wrong. I don't know what I'm doing. And it was especially intimidating because I, again, was 13 at the time, and all of these kids were older than me, and I thought they were all very cool. And the thought of sort of having to flip that situation around was really scary at the time. And the next morning, we woke them up a bit earlier than, again, looking back, was maybe necessary. We got them up at dawn to go and look for the birds, which they were not happy about. They all had to sort of go off and sort out their hair, gel their hair in the bathroom mirror before we went out into the nature reserve. And but eventually we were off. And again, they were not happy about it. They just didn't really understand, basically. They didn't understand why it was fun, why someone would want to do that with their weekend. Um, so we and again, at the time, I'd never really tried to explain to someone why I loved birds and birding so much, and I didn't really know what to do until maybe an hour later, one of the volunteers came up, and he was also very young, very cool, in his like early 20s. And he started chatting to them about peregrine falcons, because you get loads of peregrines in Bristol, and he was talking about how they hunt pigeons and how fast they can fly, and he was comparing it to the speed of Formula One race cars, and immediately these boys all perked up and they're like, yeah, Formula One, and they engaged in that conversation. And it was like a light bulb moment for the entire weekend, where it finally like clicked and slotted into place, and for the rest of the weekend they had a really good time and they really enjoyed themselves, and all it had taken was a moment where it sort of was made in reference to the life that they understand. And I think that was the first time I realized just how like alien nature in the outdoors is to people who live in inner city areas who have never really had those opportunities to spend time outdoors. And I think that was a massive lesson for me to learn, really. Also, I'm trying to change the slides, but I can't, so we might be staring at me as a baby for this entire talk, so I'm very sorry about that. But yeah, this camp went really well, and beforehand there had been a lot of people telling me that it wasn't going to go well. They were saying that there are just certain people that have no interest going out in nature, no desire, and just can't connect with nature in some shape or form. And obviously this camp had massively disproved that. So basically I wanted to know why this was a problem, why other kids weren't going out into nature. So I ended up writing to lots of the big nature organizations. I think I might have written them like actual letters because I wanted it all to be very formal. And I asked them why this was such an issue and what they were doing about it just after the camp. And basically they were all really excited to hear from me and hear about my camp, but their answer was, we know this is an issue, but we don't know how to fix it, so we're not really doing anything. And they were all really excited to talk to me. They all invited me up to their various HQs that weekend, which I couldn't do because I had school and I was going into year 9, and that felt like a very big deal at the time, and I wasn't willing to skip it to go and talk to these organizations. And I had a sort of brainwave and I was like, you know what? I'm going to bring them all together in one room. And it feels a bit silly that me as a 13-year-old is telling them how to fix their issues with engagement and bringing people outdoors. So I'll get people who actually know about these issues, who actually know the people that they're talking about, to come and talk to them instead. And my parents sort of very gently told me, that's called a conference, Maya. So I ended up organizing a conference called Race, Equality and Nature in the summer of 2016. And again, very stressful, didn't know what I was doing, felt like it was all going to go wrong. But it didn't, miraculously somehow. It was fantastic. And a lot of really interesting stuff came out of it. And I think one thing that happened in the meanwhile was that while I was organizing it, I had a lot of people tell me that there wasn't an issue, basically, that you know, the stuff that I was talking about, there wasn't anything to do with race or racism going on. It was all to do with class. And I'm sure you all know that there are a lot of issues to do with class in the UK, but I had a feeling that this wasn't one of them. And that was something that I ended up having to push back against a lot. And something incredibly like vindicating that happened was just a few months before my conference was due to happen. Some Natural England research came out that was all about how often kids go into green spaces, and it completely proved my point, which was important for my campaigning, but also I was very pleased about it on a personal level because it proved all of these people wrong, basically. And it showed that regardless of class, white children were going out into nature nearly 20% more than children from minority ethnic backgrounds, which is an issue for so many different reasons. And again, I'm sure you all know just how important nature is for us as human beings, as animals. We're supposed to be spending time outdoors and in nature, and having that connection severed is so detrimental for both our mental and our physical health. And because there's so many issues with mental illness developing, especially in younger generations, I feel like we have to take every advantage and take advantage of every opportunity, and that includes developing that connection with nature. So yeah, in that summer, I ran the Race Equality in Nature conference, and it was really successful. We had loads of these big nature organizations come, like the RSPB and the Wildlife Trusts and WWT, and they all came and they just listened. And when I was talking to someone about it afterwards, they were saying how usually when they go to a conference, they learn maybe one or two new things, but every single thing that they'd heard at this conference, they just never heard of before, which I think is incredibly important. So yeah, it went really well, and it was really basic. So we were literally talking about two things, and it was like, what are the barriers and what can we do to fix them? And the barriers were really complicated, actually. We spent a lot of time talking about it, and it was a really big range from a lot of people are scared of dogs and they don't want to go into places with dogs, especially with their children, so they end up avoiding parks and other green spaces, to really complicated social issues, like a lot of people felt like the countryside was very unwelcoming and elitist, and they were quite scared of venturing into the countryside for the first time because it was a really alien space. And we came up with lots of ways to solve that, and I think it was incredibly useful for solving a really complicated problem. And again, I was really young at the time, so I came away feeling really satisfied, really optimistic, because I felt like I'd given these organizations the blueprint of how to solve a problem that they'd been puzzling over for like decades. So I sort of went away and I waited and I waited. And nothing really happened. And I didn't really know what to do, because I sort of expected that they would just go and, like, I don't know, start some projects, start some scheme and fix the problem, and they really didn't. Um, so in the end, what I did was that autumn, I set up my charity, my organization, Black to Nature. And that was sort of the start of a really big campaign. And I think, again, if I'd gone back and told like my 13 or my 14-year-old self that I'd still be talking about this when I was like 18 or 19, I think, yeah, that wouldn't have been fun. But I don't regret it at all, because it's been yeah, a really big campaign and a really big deal. And I think it's sort of easy to assume that it's just expected that we should bring more people into nature, but I think there are so many different reasons for it. So the well-being one, like I said before, but also we're dealing with so many different environmental issues, so many different environmental crises at the moment, that I think excluding people and not bringing them in is only going to be detrimental when we need everyone on board. And I think it was David Attenborough who said people can't people can't love what they don't know. And I think that's totally it when it comes to nature, because people have no reason at all to care about the things that we love if they've never even gone out and experienced them for themselves. And yeah, I am now gonna stop quickly and try and change the slide, because I'm getting quite sick of looking at my own face, but I don't.
Maya, maybe try stop sharing the screen and then try sharing it again.
My mouse has gone. I'm just looking at myself. There's nothing else here. So I think.
Oh, it still looks like you're sharing your screen for us at the moment.
It does or it doesn't.
Yes, your picture of you as a baby is still up at the moment.
I'm very sorry, everyone.
Don't worry, though. We're enjoying you speaking, and your lovely picture of you as a baby.
Yeah. So me, I guess meanwhile, while all of this was happening, I was also spending a lot of my time bird watching, both in the UK and abroad. Um, so um, I'm trying to think. So in 2015, I was very lucky and I went on a trip to Bangladesh for 2 weeks during my February half term. But this wasn't actually unlike all my other visits there, a fun visit to visit family. This was all to do with conservation and campaigning because I didn't mention it, but at the same time I was doing all of this Black to Nature stuff, I had also started a blog called Birdgirl, which it was called Birdgirl because I liked birds. It was it was very simple, very self-explanatory, and I'd started it again because I thought it would be a fun way to make friends with other kids my age who are also into nature on the internet. And it had never particularly been for anyone to read but myself. But very quickly it got a lot of views and a lot of people were reading about like the birds I was seeing at the weekend, which I never expected. And I think at 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 the same time, I was also getting slightly bored of just talking about the birds that I was seeing at the weekend. And I felt like because I'd been given a really good platform, like one as good as if I had like a column in the local newspaper or something, um, I felt like I really wanted to take advantage of that. So I started talking about the issues that I really cared about, the environmental issues in particular. And I think my first like venture into activism or campaigning was when I was about 12, because when I was 12 there was this massive oil spill in a place called the Sundarbans, and the Sundarbans are this beautiful, once pristine mangrove forest in the south of Bangladesh, and it's really important habitat both for birds and for animals like the Bengal tiger. And I'd heard that there had been this massive oil spill via like Bangladeshi newspapers, and I sort of waited and waited, and I thought that all of our newspapers would be talking about it, and loads of people would be running campaigns and raising money and things like that, because I felt like it was a really big deal. It was a really big oil spill. Um, but no one was talking about it, and I didn't hear anything from anyone in the West. So I sort of decided that if no one else was going to talk about it, I'd do it myself. So I started blogging about it and posting it on social media and raising money for it basically. And I just talked and talked about it, went on the radio, stuff like that, and ended up raising about $30,000 to save this mangrove, save this forest. And it made a big difference, but I think also on a personal level, it made me realize just how lucky I was to have a platform, and also that I had the opportunity to platform issues on the other side of the world that people in places like the US and the UK wouldn't necessarily hear about otherwise. So something I grew to really, really care about was a little bird called the spoon-billed sandpiper, which I don't really expect people to have heard of most of the time because it's not it's very rare basically. And when I started talking about it, it was critically endangered. There are about 100 pairs of it left in the world. It was really struggling, and it spent its summers in Russia, but it spent its winters in Bangladesh, out on the mudflats in the south. And I'd been campaigning about it for a really long time, when I decided that what really needed to happen was to go to Bangladesh and to talk to people about it there, because it was sort of the inverse, where lots of people were talking about it in the UK, in the conservation community at least, but no one in Bangladesh knew about this critically endangered bird that was reliant on Bangladeshi habitats to survive, especially when there were so few, and especially when they were dealing with massive issues like pollution and contamination as they flew along places like the coast of China when migrating. So I ended up going to Bangladesh in 2015 to campaign about the spoon-billed sandpiper, and I think it was one of the most magical weeks of my life, just because I we were basically going to help with the Save the Spoonboard Sandpiper project, as well as raising awareness. So I did lots of newspaper and TV interviews and stuff like that, and it did make a big difference. I remember running into someone in a town and them just being like, I saw you on the news, and there's a really rare bird near me, isn't there, that needs protecting. And it's things like that obviously make a massive difference. But I was also lucky and I was able to go out on the actual survey, and we were basically counting how many there were to see how much they were struggling, and we managed to find 19 of these birds out on the mudflats, which, when there were only about 200 in the world at this point, it was just really upsetting and really magical at the same time. It was incredible. And yeah, so I was doing a lot of that stuff behind the scenes as well. But yeah, meanwhile, in the UK, I was doing all the Black to Nature stuff, and slowly but surely things were getting better. It was taking a long time, and after I got back from Bangladesh, I had just set up Black to Nature, and I decided what I was going to do was I was going to be really like relentless about it this time. I wasn't going to bend over backwards to help people. I was going to go and have, you know, really serious chats with people, which felt like, again, the very grown-up thing to do at the time. So I decided that I was going to try and meet with people as high up in these organizations as they would let me, basically. And I ended up talking with the heads of various big nature organizations in the UK, and basically saying to them, I know this is an issue, you know it's an issue, that you're just not connecting with loads of the communities in the UK. What are you doing about it? And the answer a year and a half later was still not a lot. But I think having to like talk to me face to face rather than through people lower down in the organization, or rather than through email, made a massive difference. And a conversation started to happen, which made a massive deal, and which made a massive difference. And I think one of the really incredible projects that came out of this period was the RSPB Aldi project, which was literally just the money raised from when they put when people had to start paying for plastic bags. The RSPB put some of that money from Aldi into a project working with kids from deprived areas, from really inner city urban areas, where it was basically doing forest school with them, but with the schools that had never gotten the opportunity to do forest school or take the kids out into green spaces or anything like that. And a lot of these kids were really poor, but a lot of them also came from ethnic minority backgrounds. And my dad actually worked with kids on that project, and he said it was just incredible to take them out for the first time, to help them connect to nature for the first time, and for them to have that, you know, incredible experience. So there were really positive things that were happening that were changing kids' lives. And I think that's the big thing, really, because when we run our Black to Nature camps, it's not just about, you know, doing fun activities, going bird watching, doing bird ringing, doing mothing, but also just about trying to give children that otherwise wouldn't get that opportunity a new perspective in terms of life. So we sit down and have a lot of conversations about them, about school, about life, about family. And it's also, for a lot of them, very exciting just because they've never gone on school camp. They've never maybe been allowed to go on a sleepover. So they quite often, on the first night of the camp away, spend the whole time sort of whispering to their friends in their sleeping bags and things like that, and generally just being very excited. And I think, yeah, in general, things are getting better. And I think one of the really interesting things is that lockdown, as a lot of you all know, has really highlighted inequality when it comes to green spaces. So obviously a lot of people who live in poorer areas or urban areas just haven't had access to green spaces in the same way, especially when all the parks were shut, versus people who are very lucky, like me, who live in the middle of the countryside, who have got nature and green spaces all around them. Which, where I live in Bristol, that's been particularly heightened, because a lot of the trees are currently being cut down in Bristol, especially in the poorer areas, including really old trees and trees that are really important for the community. So I know there's a massive oak tree that's maybe 100 years old opposite my grandma's house in Bristol, that has been a feature there forever. And my mum remembers it when she was a kid. And it's one of the only bits of nature in the area. And it's about to be chopped down, and it's called the Ashley Down Oak. And, you know, there's things like that happening at the same time. But I think there's a lot of conversations and a lot of projects happening going forward, which I think are going to be super important, especially because, like, this is something that I've had to come to terms with a bit, because going out into nature is such a privilege for a lot of people, and especially in the UK. And in my opinion, especially post industrial revolution, where everything sort of flipped around, so that people more well off were living in the countryside and people less well off were living in the city. And since then, it's been a privilege where you need enough time and energy and money to make your way into the countryside to spend time in nature in green spaces, which obviously is terrible. And I personally think that access to nature should be a human right. Um, but yeah, things are slowly getting better, and I think that's what's important. So at the same time, just quickly, I am doing a lot of work within the climate change movement as well, um, which I think is also incredibly important, because it's sort of a similar thing that's been going on a much bigger, much more world-ending scale, where essentially loads and loads of countries, third world countries, have been cut out of all of the conversations to do with climate change. Again, countries like Bangladesh, which are feeling the effects of climate change. People are suffering because of climate change, but people aren't particularly listening to their voices. And Bangladesh is a particularly pertinent example, because there are currently 4 million climate change refugees living in the capital city, which is an incredibly small country. So that's an incredibly large number. So you've got countries like that dealing with climate change all the time. I know my family, who live in my granddad's village in Bangladesh, have been struggling a lot because climate change has been damaging their crops, and they essentially haven't been left with enough food to eat every year. So we've got things like that going on. So a lot of the work that I've been doing in the last year has been to do with promoting different voices in the climate change movement. I think there's a lot of not really taking that into account. And I think another really key example is fast fashion, which a lot of young people in particular are really not into fast fashion, and sorry, young environmentalists in particular really don't like fast fashion, understand that it's really bad for the environment, both in terms of labour, in terms of the water that it uses. But there's been loads of big campaigns from organisations like Extinction Rebellion for people to stop buying cheap clothing, for people to buy expensive, long-lasting clothing, and, you know, to help the environment that way. When in reality, that's so not taking account of so many different factors. The most obvious one being that a lot of people on our end of things in the UK literally just can't afford to stop buying cheap clothing, even if it doesn't last as long, because it's cheap and that's what they wear. And sustainable clothing is really expensive. And in fact, being environmentally friendly in general is really expensive, which again is why there are so many issues to do with classism. But I think on the other end of things, which people have really been ignoring, is coming back to this concept of not really listening to countries from places in the global south like Bangladesh, because I know that the textiles industry is one of the biggest industries in Bangladesh, especially for women. There's so many factories creating the clothes that we wear in the West, and the thought of just cutting them off, sort of like what happened at the start of lockdown, and just stopping those industries in those tracks, you know, leaves thousands and thousands and thousands of people out in the streets, when in reality, when you start to listen to those people and listen to how it would affect them, you can come up with really easy solutions. Like, okay, we're going to stop doing fast fashion, but we can convert those factories and have people making other things, other textile based things that we do need all the time. So I think basically what I'm trying to say is that whether it's on a really low level within the UK or in a really broad international level, I'm always pushing for people's voices to be heard who haven't traditionally been heard. And I think it's incredibly important. Yeah, so in terms of me personally, sorry, just to wrap up quickly, strangely, this last year has been really good for me when it hasn't been great for other people. February in particular was fantastic last year because Greta Thunberg came to Bristol to speak for a massive youth strike, and I got to speak on stage with her. But also because Bristol University awarded me an honorary doctorate for all of the campaigning that I do and all of the activism that I do, which obviously was an incredible moment in my life, and I'm incredibly grateful for that. So yeah, I mean, obviously if anyone has any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, but thank you guys for all coming and listening. And now I need to figure out how to escape me as a baby.
Thank you, Mya Rose. That was incredible. It's so fantastic to hear how passionate you are for these issues. And we're so lucky to have you as a spokesperson to push these issues. Oh, you've managed to go on to the next slide now. You might have to stop sharing your screen if that's all right. Can you see where to do that? Is it not coming up?
Aha, yes, I've figured out how to do it. Great. Sorry, guys.
Did you want to show us quickly any of those slides?
It's all right. I only had a couple. I just had pictures of kids that have come on the camp because yeah, they're all lovely, but it's fine. Sorry. Carry on.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Right. So please do put your questions in the chat for Mya Rose, and I can read them out for you. So while everyone's busy typing, one of the things I was thinking about while you were talking is about sort of nature connection at school, in schools. So I know many years ago, I used to be a countryside ranger, and we used to take kids out from Telford into the woodland and do sort of all nature connection experiences with them, which was fantastic. But the centre that I worked at lost the funding and it closed down, and I think that's probably happened in a lot of places. And I don't know how much sort of nature connection and environmental education kids get at school now. I mean, there has been a sort of resurgence of forest schools, which is great. And I mean, my son gets some forest school education as part of that. But I think schools have got a big role to play in this as well, haven't they?
Yeah, I totally agree. And again, I was really lucky because I went to a very countryside primary school. There were like 70 of us maybe, and we were in a tiny village. So I was very lucky. I was in my last year of primary when they introduced primary forest school. So I got to do a year of it, and it was my favorite thing. I loved it so much. And again, my dad was actually the one that did it, and he's done it for nearly 10 years now with kids from that primary school. And he said every single kid has obviously loved going outside and being able to run around and do naturey things and just spend time outdoors rather than in the classroom. But unfortunately, that's actually being rolled back by a lot of primary schools at the moment because there's just so much content, so much syllabus that they don't feel like they can give kids that time, which I think is a massive shame. But in general, yeah, I think schools play such an important role, both primary and secondary school. And I think even incorporating nature and the outdoors into school and syllabus in a really small way would make a massive difference. Because again, like sort of like I was talking about earlier, but I think nature and the countryside just feeling so distant and so alien is what stops a lot of people from venturing out there for the first time.
Yeah, that's true. Right, we've got a question from Grant here, and he said, did you find many bird watchers amongst the climate strike movement and vice versa?
I think that's a really interesting question, actually, because mainly no, weirdly. Which you would think that you'd see, like, bird watchers love nature, so or nature hobbyists in general love nature, so you'd think you'd see them a lot of those sorts of things. But there's actually a very clear divide, and mainly at a lot of these protests and on these petitions and things like this, it's a lot of young people, which obviously you've got the school strikes for climate, which you have to be going to school to do those, but just in general. And I think that's something that's been very strange but very exciting as well, because there's so many kids who just care so much, that are spending so much of their life just trying to save the planet in some shape or form, even if it just makes a tiny impact. They want to help. um, However, just because they're not going to protest doesn't mean that birders and nature people in general don't care, because I know a lot of them care massively, and it affects major things in their life, down to like how they vote, or which, I don't know, petitions they choose to sign, or what they share on social media. And I think people express that in different ways, but again, in my opinion, I think it comes down to people experiencing nature in some shape or form, because I really think that that affects the way that they look at the world and think about environmental issues like climate change or biodiversity loss.
Yes, absolutely. And Debbie asks, what key things do you feel we could all be doing to help engage more young people in our local wildlife related activities?
Yeah, so I think that's a slightly interesting question, partially just because for some, unless you do run a group, there's not a lot you can do except be very welcoming to people. Like if you see them, I don't know, struggling a bit, and it feels like, you know, they might not have maybe come to the countryside before. Even just last time I went out on a walk, there was someone that was struggling to park a bit, in sort of one of those very rural kind of a field, not a car park type thing, struggling to park, and just sort of standing there and helping direct her into the space made a massive difference. And she went from looking quite like upset to looking very happy. You know, it's just making people feel welcome. But I think in terms of engaging young people, there's loads of stuff you can do. So I think, like, firstly, just thinking about what engaging with nature is in the first place. Because I think in the UK, we have a very rigid idea of what that is compared to a lot of other people from other countries that I've talked to. And it's very much, I guess it's kind of what I do really, but sort of got your binoculars on, walking through the RSPB reserve, stuff like that. But when it comes down to it, that just isn't interesting for a lot of people, young or not. And so I think expanding that idea of what engaging with nature is, so that it can be like, I don't know, literally anything outdoors really. But I think also with younger kids, making it really fun and exciting, which sounds obvious, but one of the favorite things for the younger kids is doing a bio blitz. And this is like primary school age kids, but it's literally just a big competition. It's usually boys v girls, and they just have to find as many species of everything as they can, and they're all running around and they have no idea what anything is. And they've got some like information sheets, and it's just really good fun. And I think it's so easy to get bogged down in sort of the scientific or factual side of it, where it's sort of, you know, learning the scientific names, knowing the bird calls, when nature's just supposed to be fun, I think. And I think a lot of kids, if you give them that opportunity to have fun outdoors, they will.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you can engage their curiosity, it really helps, doesn't it? Fantastic ideas there. So Stefan was asking, well, he says, thank you very much for your talk, a very inspiring story. So he's got a very interesting question, actually. So have you kept in touch with any of the young people who came to your camp? And have you got any idea of how that's affected them over the longer term?
Yeah. So I mean, to clarify, like, we're never trying to make like staunch, like, you know, really big scientists or environmentalists out of the kids that come on the camp, but we are trying to forge that connection with nature. And we've had a real range of really nice stories from kids, coming from like relatively low level but really happy ones, like girls talking about I don't know, noticing the birds flying around as they walk from the bus home, or like when they're in the park with their mates and things like that. To there was one boy we talked to who has actually, it was actually on the very first camp we ever ran, who has now gone in, is trying to get into the nature sector and go into a nature-based job, because we did just sit down and talk to him about his future and what he cares about, and that combined with spending a really nice period of time outdoors made a massive difference. And that was really funny, actually, because I ran into him really years later, and he just had everything positive to say about the nature camp that he'd come on, and it was a really like emotional moment, to be honest.
It's so fantastic to hear how you've impacted someone's life like that, isn't it? Hang on, the questions have just moved down a second. Hang on a minute. Technical hitch. So Martin was asking, he also said the talk was really interesting, and thanks for sharing what you're doing. Have you got any suggestions of how we could get more kids and adults to come to North Devon to share in nature?
I mean, there's so much that's so beautiful about Devon. And funnily enough, we've always run the nature camps sort of in the southwest, in the Glastonbury area. But this year we're probably going to end up running them in Devon, possibly North Devon, which we're very excited about. So
well, we'd love to welcome you to the countryside centre, definitely. That would be fantastic.
Yeah, so I think Devon has like so much to offer people, so it's just about like highlighting that, really. And interestingly, I mean, I think there are lots of really interesting schemes and things like that, but if you wanted to do it for yourself, I think the easiest way, without making it really extreme, is just to like link up with community groups that already exist in cities, or youth groups or something like that, because a lot of them are always interested in doing new activities, I suspect, especially post lockdown. And I think just making contact with people and making them aware that this is something interesting, something new, in a supportive environment that they can check out. And I'm sure that there will be people that are interested in trying that out.
Yeah, that's a fantastic idea. We have some really good different groups actually working in North Devon, so perhaps we need to get in touch with them. That's a fantastic idea. So Shudi says, what do you feel are the best enablers for people to connect with nature? She says she works in a community therapeutic horticulture, so would welcome your thoughts.
Yeah, so we do loads of different activities and the kids do love all of them, but I think something I've really noticed is that or not just kids, people in general really connect with things that are really tactile when they're sort of feeling and seeing nature for themselves up close, and that can mean loads of different things. So we do mothing with the kids, and quite often, or sometimes the person who's doing the mothing will like put a moth on someone's hand, and they'll be slightly terrified because a lot of these kids are terrified of moths, but they'll sort of hold it and eventually get used to it, and then sort of start like showing all their friends it and stuff like that. And just like it makes all the difference, them being the one that's making contact with it. Same with we do bird ringing, which obviously we don't let the kids do the ringing, but afterwards we put it in their hand and let them be the one that lets the bird fly away. And again, a lot of them are terrified of the bird, but it's a really big moment for a lot of them. And we're even doing tree planting days this weekend, actually, as a sort of camp alternative during lockdown. And again, it's a really tactile thing. You know, we've got kids getting really muddy, getting really into it, just sort of grubbing around in the ground, basically. And I think just getting really into it is what makes all the difference.
Lovely, thank you for that. I think it's really great, isn't it, when you can see people interacting with nature like that. It really gives a different perspective. So we've got lots of questions. I'm trying to fit them all in before the end. So Jo has got what does she say? So she said it's been very interesting to hear about all the different perspectives around social circles and birding, and she's been really inspired by Queer Nature's work. I don't know if you've come across their work before, so that will be something to look into. So she's been really loved hearing what you're doing, and amazed that you organised the camp at 13, which is really very impressive. And Alex says, thanks for the talk, it was brilliant. You've talked a bit about it already, but what would you suggest getting young people from the inner city and schools more interested in wildlife, rather than those who are just already in the country and have it as part of their everyday lives?
Yeah, I think because they've talked about both schools and other ways of getting people in, and I think it's difficult just because, like we talked about before, a lot of schools are under a lot of pressure already, and even though it's sort of the nice way to go, it's like on a practical level would be really difficult for a lot of these schools to do anything like that, as well as I feel like you'd need a really good teacher to really get kids engaged in that. And I think like lots of people do have that story of that great teacher, but a lot of people don't as well. I think, like I said before, community groups are actually a really great way, especially in more inner city areas, of getting people to try new things, because it's sort of in a community where you feel very secure, and you feel very comfortable, so it's sort of more comfortable to try new things. But it's actually questions like this why I think schemes or projects like Black to Nature are so important, because for a lot of these kids it is pretty much the only way that they would ever come out into the countryside or come out into nature. And there's a lot of behind the scenes work that goes into it that means ours work in a way that they might not otherwise. So we spend quite a lot of time talking to the parents and stuff like that before, and convincing them to let the kids come on the camps, because not because they don't want them to have a good time, but because they're worried for their well-being. Like I said before, a lot of these kids have never even gone on school camp because their parents won't let them. And we have to make sure all sorts of things are done, like all of the food is halal, and the boys and girls tents are very separate, and we never run a camp during Ramadan, and things like that make a massive difference. But it's not just Black to Nature, there are loads of other fantastic projects as well. One for older people is Black Girls Hike, which is, as the title suggests, Black women going walking in groups in the countryside. And there's also a project that's just started up in London called Flock Together, which is for birders, or to encourage bird watching in inner city London, which I think it's quite new, but I'm going to be really excited to see how that carries on. So yeah, it's really difficult, which is kind of why it hasn't been solved, but there are people working on it.
Yes, yeah, it sounds like there's lots more organisations coming in championing the cause now, which is brilliant. Right, so Grant says he loves the work that you did with the spoonbill sandpipers in Bangladesh. Do you think that we should highlight bird migration as a connection between countries and continents?
Yes, totally. I'm really glad that's come up, because I think migration is such an important, or such an interesting way to look at the world as humans, because we have so many borders and think of things so separately. And I think migration shows just how closely the world is all linked together. So the spoon-billed sandpiper is a lovely example, just because it the reason it's struggling so much is because of so many different things the whole way down the flyway. So I mentioned issues on the Chinese coast, but there's issues in Russia, there's issues in Bangladesh, there's issues in all the countries in between. And the only way you can start to solve those is looking at it as a whole, not country by country. But I think, yeah, again, you talked about, let me find it, talked about sub-Saharan Africa, and I think, again, like a lot of birds, like personally I think of like a swallow or a cuckoo as being very English birds, when in reality a cuckoo, for example, spends the majority of its life in Africa, not in the UK. And I think especially for kids it offers like a slightly different perspective at looking at the world that I think is really important.
Yeah, I think it's really important to look at the global perspective on things, especially obviously about the issue of climate change as well, and how nature's interlinked. So just a couple more comments, I think. So, sorry. So Western L says, thank you for an inspiring talk and evening, Mya. Love hearing what you've been doing and some great ideas for sharing in North Devon. And Rebecca also says, thank you so much for your interesting talk. Bristol in the world are very blessed to have you and your passion. So that's lovely, isn't it?
Thank you.
And Plastic Free North Devon, final one here. Brilliant talk. So we're building an outreach program using a combination of virtual reality and real life experiences like snorkeling safaris on Lundy with a selection of children from low income and vulnerable backgrounds. The aim is that they will volunteer with us over the summer and share their experiences with their schools and peers. Do you have any experiences or thoughts about using VR in a way to initiate connection and improve understanding?
I'm not gonna lie, I've never particularly thought about VR before, and I think that is a really interesting way of looking things. And I think it's interesting kind of because it links into what I was talking about earlier in terms of expanding that idea of what connecting with nature is. And I think VR is totally a valid way to get people to connect and understand with the outdoors and, you know, the countryside and nature. So I think, I mean, I think the project sounds really interesting in general, and I'd love if, oh, no name, if Plastic Free North Devon could make contact at some point, even just to chat about it. But I totally think, like, on a more general level, like having these really interesting projects that are targeting specifically kids that are struggling more, that are from low income backgrounds and things like that, are really important, and those are the ones that end up having a really big impact on a bigger level, but also like on those kids' lives, you know. But yeah,
fantastic idea to finish on. So we'll draw the evening to a close there. So thank you very much. So just to let you know, next week's talk is with Bryony Paul, and she's from the North Devon Biosphere. So she's from the Pledge for Nature campaign. So she's going to be talking about what we can do for wildlife this spring. So hope you can join us for that, for one of our future talks. So thank you for all coming this evening and all your great contributions. It's greatly appreciated. And finally, I'd like to say a big thank you to Mya Rose for such a fascinating evening and inspiring evening. So if you could all join me in giving her the virtual round of applause or thumbs up. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you guys so much for all coming and like listening to me for an hour. And thank you all for your very interesting questions, actually. So yeah.
It's been great. Have a great evening, everybody.